Hello there, Ben Bowers, the Spirit Specialist, and I am here today to talk to you about Filey Peated finish. The reason we've got shaky cam is I've literally just got this in the shop. I had a sample bottle given to me last week, so I actually did the review this morning, waiting for the stock to turn up, but it is now here on the shelf available to buy. So if you like the sound of it, and it's absolutely fantastic, spoiler alert, then please do get in touch to buy a bottle, because I don't have many of them and there aren't many in the first batch. But before I tell you what it tastes like, let me tell you about the distillery itself. The Spirit of Yorkshire Distillery was founded in 2016 by Tom Mellor and David Thompson. Tom was an arable farmer who set up the Wold Top Brewery in 2013 and already had ideas about opening a whisky distillery in conjunction, and so partnered with long-standing friend and marketing expert David to set up the new Spirit venture. The barley used for both beer and whisky production is grown on Tom's own fields, with milling, mashing and fermentation taking place at the brewery 4.5 miles away from the distillery itself. If the distillery was in Scotland, this would not be allowed due to Scotch Whisky Association regulations. In planning the distillery, Tom and David enlisted the help of legendary distillery consultant Jim Swan, who was well known around the world for assisting new distilleries such as Kavalan, Kilchoman, Penderyn and Lindores Abbey before his untimely death in 2017. The house style will ultimately be akin to the likes of Glenlivet, fruit forward but somewhat delicate in body. The master distiller is a young man named Joe Clark. Joe's first job in the whisky industry was as a part-timer in the York branch of the whisky shop, at that time managed by none other than yours truly. His passion and enthusiasm was obvious from the very start, and he has worked tirelessly to ensure the early spirit releases from the distillery, under the brand name of Filey, are of the highest quality. However, as is a legal requirement whenever I discuss Joe, I am obliged to show you this picture of Joe with our good friend Ollie Chilton of the Whisky Exchange during a trip to Islay. Feel free to ask him about the long hair, it's quite the story. In addition to 2 copper pot stills, a directional arm can connect to a 4-plate column still, which enables them to play around with reflux and redistillation. Maturation takes place principally in first fill ex-bourbon casks from Old Forester, although plenty of experimentation has been done with other cask types and finishing. Indeed, the current core range features a finish using Muscatel wine casks and an STR ex-Rioja cask finish. STR, or shaved, toasted and recharred, is a signature of Jim Swan's legacy. Filey flagship, however, can be seen as the key introduction to the Filey flavour profile, with light, fruity and creamy notes throughout. Unlike other recent new whisky distilleries across the UK, Spirit of Yorkshire never had any intention to delve into the massive gin or growing rum market, which would have given them an early and potentially lucrative revenue stream. The only concession they've made was the release of a whisky and malt spirit cream liqueur at the end of 2020, allowing visitors to their distillery who didn't drink whisky the chance to still appreciate their output. No peated barley is used at the Spirit of Yorkshire Distillery, so the Filey peated cask finish introduces a slightly smoky element by finishing a batch of ex-bourbon matured whisky, aged around 3 to 3.5 years old, for an average of 6 months in casks that was sourced from an Islay distillery that also runs a field-to-glass operation. In fact, the said distillery may have been mentioned previously in this video. However, this was not a specific collaboration between those distilleries, and future peated finish releases, if there are any, may well utilise casks from other distilleries or even regions. As with the rest of the core range, it's bottled at 46% ABV. So, that's a bit of information about the distillery itself and my good mate Joe. I do actually have a small sample of the whisky that I was given last week sent in the post. It's due to arrive today. I'm waiting for the delivery to turn up. It should arrive in a couple of hours. And I will be actually having a sample bottle to share with customers as well. So if you are interested in coming in and buying this, you're more than welcome to try it. So, Islay cask finish, a sort of unnamed distillery, although a lot of people I think do know which distillery this is. This is not a collaboration with that distillery. They basically source the casks from this particular distillery to do the finish with it. There's nothing to say that in a future peated cask release they don't use something from a different distillery. So they don't really want to kind of go, oh, we've worked with this distillery, because they haven't. Joe's basically done his work in terms of the stock that they have existing, selecting a cask from a distillery or a few casks from a particular distillery to give them a smoky version. It is not, we want to work with this particular distillery to do a partnership. This is more a case of, okay, what does Filey taste like, with a kind of slightly smoky element to it. So we've got the Muscatel, we've got the STR that are taking them in slightly different directions, with the flagship as like the core house range. Let's see what happens when we introduce a slightly smoky element. So on the nose, And what's nice is that it's up front. So as soon as I'd heard that there was going to be a peated cask finish, and there have been peated cask finishes of other distilleries, what can happen is the cask influence is not particularly great. There is always a risk that actually that cask influence of whatever's been in before, and it needs to be pretty heavily peated whiskey already in that cask to then soak into the wood to then reintroduce those flavours back into the new spirit that's coming in, or the new whiskey that might be coming in to do a finish. The danger is that you don't actually get much of a smoky influence in there, because you are using essentially, for want of a better turn of phrase, second-hand smoke. You are not using that peated barley element to give yourself an intensity of smoke, or you're not playing with levels of unpeated and peated barley to get that lightly peated element. You don't have that luxury of being able to really control kind of what your level of smoke is. You're relying on how much of the spirit previously, that peated element, has gone into the wood to then be reintroduced with the new whiskey or spirit that you're then putting in to get your influence from it. Is it actually going to work? So there is always a danger, and I've had some peated cask finishes before where it's actually been almost unnoticeable, or what there has been very, very light and kind of not really there. But what's good on here is it's obvious straight off the bat, but it's not really in your face, but it is slightly more potent than I was expecting it to be. There's a nice briny note there. It's kind of sea salty. There's black pepper as well. What there isn't is much of a medicinal effect, and that kind of makes sense with the distillery that has been used for these peated casks, which I've always associated more with an earthy smokiness rather than that medicinal style that you tend to get with some other island distilleries, particularly the ones on the south coast. It's much more salty. There's more of an ashiness. There's a lovely slight sweetness to it as well. And what I don't know is whether the sweetness is from the cask or the sweetness is from the whiskey itself that's been in there, because there is that sweet bourbon cask element from Filey Bay itself. But it works really well. There's a nice kind of sweet, kind of like barbecue sauce element to it, as well as a slightly ashy, slightly bonfirey, like dying embers of a bonfire when some of the meat juices have dripped in, and you've also kind of had some barbecue sauce layered over the top. It's a really, really nice, complex, but it's weirdly intense but delicate. There's a lot going on here, but it's very, very, the threads are very nicely woven together. I really do like that nose, and I love noses on whiskies, or any other spirit, to be honest, where you can just keep nosing it and keep getting something different. To me, that's a really good sign of you're going to get something really well made, when you don't even have to put the thing in your mouth and you're already really enjoying it and can spend a lot of time with it. Love that nose, loads of stuff going on, and it kind of changes every time you put your nose back in. There's kind of like slightly sweeter elements. What I've also realised is, as I'm just rubbing the glass against my nose, is that I actually need to trim my nose hairs. You don't need to know that, I'm getting old. Anyway, love that nose, really, really good. And what's on the nose really does carry through. You do get a saltiness. There's a kind of that saline element. Now, it doesn't start salty, it turns salty. It starts off quite sweet. And I think that's that flagship, for want of a better word. It's essentially flagship in a peated cask. Joe has played around with some of the casks, so it's not exactly the same as flagship, but you are looking at that bourbon matured Filey Bay core spirit. That's giving you that sweetness to start with. And then the smokiness sort of comes in quite quickly, and then it turns kind of saline-y, not salty, but kind of sea salt and slightly saline towards the end. And then a smoke, then kind of more of a drier smoke comes through on the finish. There's loads going on here. I'm getting like hard candies as well. There's a really nice sweetness that turns quite juicy, and it reminds me of strawberries and raspberries hard candies. So we're not talking opal fruit Starboost, whatever you want to call them. If you're watching from America, Jolly Ranchers, this is what really brings to mind a sort of sweet but tangy juiciness that's quite mouth-watering, is interwoven with the barbecue element that's not sickly sweet and not overpowering at all. It really does kind of go through a journey of flavours on this. There's loads going on here. I think this is absolutely fantastic. Now, I really like peated whiskey, and if you don't like peated whiskey, you're probably going to struggle with this. But I think this is actually a really good introduction to peated whiskey. I think this is one of those peated elements, a bit like So Ben Romack, 10-year-old, and a few others, and I kind of argue the Lechek red wine finish as well, where the smokiness isn't intense and there is a lot of other flavours going on, as well as this inherent sweetness that actually is a great introduction to what peated whiskey can present. This is a really good kind of stepping stone into, I don't really like peated whiskey, or I've never had peated whiskey. Well, try this and you might find that if you're enjoying this, you might want to progress further down that road. But what I love about this is there is a delicacy to it. There is a light touch. It is not full on and in your face, but it still has lots and lots of flavour profiles going on. There is incredible complexity going on here, and it is always changing. But because you've got that smoky element as well, it means the finish really does travel. It really does go on for quite a while. You don't need a lot of this in your glass, and yet you can still spend a long time on this, really, really enjoying it. And as with the nose, every mouthful you take, there's something new, there's something interesting. There's sweetness, there's kind of, I'm getting like charred meringue on top of almost a lemon meringue pie, but it's the lemon element of a lemon meringue pie isn't quite as sharp, it's quite sweet. But there is a citrusy element in there. There is a soft meringue. There is a little bit of black pepper. There's salt and vinegar on fish and chips. There's so much stuff going on here. It's absolutely fantastic. Remarkable job that Joe's done here in terms of balancing the core flavour of Filey Bay, which really does come through. Filey Bay, particularly the flagship as the house style, has a lovely fresh sweetness to it. It's quite fruit forward, but there is also an underlying kind of creamy sweetness, and that works brilliantly with the Islay casks. I'd love to see what happens with casks from other distilleries, because knowing the distillery that this is, you've got that slightly peppery, slightly drier smokiness. I'd be really intrigued to see what happens when it goes a slightly more medicinal line from maybe one of the other island distilleries, or somewhere like, say, Lechek, which is a bit more barbecue and a bit more sweet. There's plenty of scope, and what it brilliantly does is it also gives you a very different expression for the Filey Bay range as an introduction for, okay, you've got the slightly sweet style of the Muscatel, you've got the berry style of the STR, you've got the core house style of the flagship. This takes Filey Bay in a completely different direction, and I don't think that I'm not saying, oh, Joe, you really need to start doing heavily peated barley and doing a heavily peated Filey Bay. I don't really think that's going to work. I don't actually think that much more of a peated influence than this would really do it any favours, because the Filey Bay style is quite delicate, and therefore it's probably going to be a little bit overpowered by anything more intense than this. But I'd certainly like to see them try and see if they can make it work. I'm not sure whether it would be worth an actual release, maybe as a one-off, as an experimentation. Okay, so rather brilliantly, my iPhone decided to completely die through the middle of recording, although maybe it was getting a little bit more of me just waffling on about how good I think this particular whiskey is. Anyway, in conclusion, it's fantastic. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It actually exceeds my expectations. I was really intrigued to see what the end result would be as soon as I'd heard that there would be a peated cask finish. And I genuinely think Joe's nailed it. I think it's brilliant. I think it's up there with some of the best lightly peated whiskies that are out there that offer a delicacy, a complexity, yet an intensity. It seems really odd to say it, that it's delicate yet intense, and yet it's absolutely fantastic. It's available through our website, www.spiritspecialist.com. We do offer UK nationwide delivery. You're more than welcome to come in and try it. I should have it in later on today, and I will have a sample bottle. So that's me done. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.